Since the beginning of the COVID outbreak and the ensuing financial crisis, there has certainly been no shortage of historical comparisons to make sense of these extraordinary times. Searching for lessons from the past, historians and public intellectuals have looked back to the medieval bubonic plague or the Spanish flu following World War I to gain perspective on public health emergencies. Likewise, as public money rains down on the world's wealthiest economies, through the accumulation of massive debt, historians have also looked for precedents in public finance to understand the consequences. The most obvious comparisons have been drawn with the massive stimulus injected into the American economy in the 1930s following the Great Depression, and the Marshall Plan designed to rebuild Europe following the Second World War. No doubt these comparisons are telling, but as useful as they may be, they are only so helpful. During the Great Depression, for example, the problem was financial first, and then economic. Whereas today, as we know, the situation is reversed. A majority of the world's population was simply forced to stay home. The economic machine stopped, and the financial consequences in the stock market, for example, are still largely unknown. As for the Marshall Plan, it came after almost a half-decade of the most destructive total war the world had ever seen. In spite of the horrors of what we've seen with COVID-19, they are dwarfed by the death and destruction that followed World War II. From these perspectives, a more fitting comparison is perhaps to be found in the economic, financial, and especially fiscal consequences of the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune, which took place in 1870 and 1871. Certainly less well known than the previous two examples, there are arguments in favor of a comparison along these lines. First, the Franco-Prussian War was relatively short by the standard of the world wars of the 20th century, stretching from July 1870 through January 1871. Most of the fighting took place very early in the conflict, followed by a devastating siege on Paris through January. Frustrated by the series of military defeats and the peace treaty, and animated by their radical convictions, revolutionary movements called communes broke out across France in 1870 and 1871. Among them, the Paris Commune erupted on March 18th and lasted through the end of May, roughly the duration of the current confinement. All the more intense for its brevity, the Commune has captured political and social imaginaries ever since. Though military and political, the Siege of Paris and the Commune may nonetheless have lessons to teach us about dealing with the fallout from COVID-19. What's the connection? Well, most importantly, the economic, financial, and ultimately fiscal consequences of this relatively short war and the 2 months of Parisian revolt were extraordinary, even if oftentimes underappreciated. First, the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune left France with a bill of approximately 7 to 9 billion francs. Or to put it in perspective, nearly 4 times the annual national budget. It was a question not just of paying 5 billion francs or 5 billion in reparation to the new German Empire, but also of paying for the massive expenses of the war and the impact of a Parisian economy almost entirely shut down by 2 months of revolution. As one observer argued at the time, loans of all type have been contracted, requisitions of all forms need to be reimbursed, family indemnities need to be paid, before he concluded that a more crushing weight has never fallen on a people. The immediate repayment of the war reparations and debt was made possible through unprecedented borrowing by the French state. The problem, however, like today, was how was this borrowing to be financed? The first response was increased taxation. When the average for the 1860s is compared to the average for the 1870s, we see that there was a rise in state receipts of approximately 45%, essentially overnight. Nor did the state's income significantly decrease in the years that followed. The transformation was no less radical in the realm of expenditure as a share of GDP. In the 5 years leading up to 1870, the average of expenditure as a share of GDP hovered around 10%. It then shot up to a stunning 19% in the 5 years that followed, in the immediate aftermath of the war. By 1880, it had settled in at 16%, where it remained until the end of the century. Between 1870 and 1879, the share of public spending on the debt, that is, what the debt cost the French budget, almost doubled from an average of 20% in the decade prior to the conflict to approximately 40% following 1870. And yet it is particularly striking that in spite of the massive increase in revenue and state debt, the French GNP grew at a far more reasonable pace, increasing by approximately 3 and sometimes as high as 8% on average per annum. In other words, in the 1870s, the state was able to increase its revenues by more than 45%, increase its debt by almost 77%, and increase its public spending by over 58%, while its economy expanded at a rate of between 3 and 8% per annum. As a result, the proportion of taxes as a share of the national GNP went from approximately 11% to 16%, where it remained until World War I. So how did they do it? To be clear, the revolutionary nature of this transformation was not the result of inventing new modes of taxation. The response was actually a subtle shift in tax policy. The French state generated the massive new state revenue by adding almost unnoticeable sums to already existing taxes on consumption, trade, natural resources, and other products. What are referred to as indirect taxes, or what we common times refer to today as value-added taxes, as opposed to direct taxes like the income tax, became the norm. And each one of these little taxes was increased by a few centimes. France had relied primarily on indirect taxes since the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the century. What was new then was the deployment of this instrument on an entirely new scale and the new areas toward which these resources were directed. The state used the receipts from the increased taxes to cover the debt and the cost of reparations resulting from the war, paying the reparations at an astonishing rate. However, revenues, expenditures, and debt never decreased back to pre-1870 levels. Meanwhile, public spending soared. The share for public instruction doubled, for example, contributing to the great legacy of the Third Republican schools. The extraordinary expenses for public works followed a similar trajectory, leading to infrastructural investments by the state that tripled in the 1870s. The direction of increased peacetime tax revenue to civil investments reveals the revolutionary quality of fiscal transformations that can follow relatively short periods of extreme economic stress. The president of the French Republic at the time, Adolphe Thiers, famously asked, "In the realm of taxation, what is necessary to change an entire system?" He responded, "A seasonal accident." Considering the extraordinary economic impact of the corona outbreak, he may just be right.